Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins.
Somewhere beyond the salt-scoured cliffs of the windshore, where the tides speak in half-forgotten tongues, there stood a lighthouse carved of shattered marble and sea-worn bone. Its walls were rimed with salt blossoms, tiny pearly things that clung to every fissure. Thickets of pale growth that bloomed in the absence of light. The air here moved through hollow halls like a tired breath, carrying the faint echo of bell rings no living ear had heard for 100 generations. I first heard of the lighthouse in a dream that was not mine, a whisper carried on an ebbing current. It spoke of a wound beneath the stones, something lost to the deep, and of a single lantern that glowed with the heart of a broken star. None alive could say who built it, nor why its beam never reached the sky. But each night, in the hush before dawn, a silver light would spill from its upper window, slow as drifting pollen, unhurried as memory itself. The village at the foot of the cliffs, fog-choked, half-submerged in brine, grew few crops and fewer children. Fishermen spoke of nets that filled with ghost fish, pale shapes that pulsed with a sorrow too vast for language. Mothers told bedtime blessings against waking the salt ghosts that prowled the rocks. These things were spoken of in quiet corners, in the low light of oil lamps, always in the hush that came before sleep swallowed the world. I arrived one dusk, guided by the faint shimmer of that lighthouse glow. My boat cut through waves as soft as spilled mercury, each crest reflecting shards of an ancient lament. The seaweed trailed behind like hair unbraided, each strand tangled with sighs no mortal voice could voice. When I set foot on the shore, the tide receded in slow obeisance, leaving pools that mirrored a sky veiled in silver-gray sorrow. In the center of the village stood a shrine to forgotten gods, an altar of driftwood and brackish crystal circled by rusted bells whose clappers had long since crumbled. No offerings remained, only the faint scent of salt and old hymns. It was here I found my first trace of what had been broken, a single, tarnished coin bearing a star motif, its edges eaten by rust. It felt heavy against my palm, as if the weight of 1,000,000 unshed tears lay beneath its dented face. The villagers called the coin the heart of Eärendil, though none could recall whether Eärendil was a man or a name for the storm. They said it was born of a pact made beneath the ocean's furthest floor, a promise sealed in living light. But that light had dimmed long ago, and with it faded the names and stories that once wove warmth into every hearth. Left behind was only a wound, open as tide-torn cliffs, pulsing with absence. My nights in the inn were filled with restless dreams. I saw a lone mariner, bent and worn, standing at the prow of a ship carved from the bones of whales. Above him, a star hovered, dull, fractured, yet molten with longing. He held it aloft like a pale lantern, its glow trembling against waves that whispered his name in dark lullabies. I woke before dawn, breath heaving, convinced that the star's sorrow clung to my ribs. Each morning, I climbed the spiral stairs of the lighthouse, every step slick with salt dust and time. The walls were scored with lines of runes, half erased by wind-bitten stone. I traced them with trembling fingers, shadows of words I could not speak, symbols that thrummed with something lost. There, in the highest room, sat a lantern hung from a slender iron hook. Its glass was dark and honeyed, filigreed with silver veins like the cracks in a heart. Inside the lantern rested the coin, the heart of Eärendil. When I lifted it, light seeped from the fractures, a breath of dawn in the dim chamber. The glow wandered across the walls, lingering on etched names, ghost shadows of those who had gazed upon this room before. I felt their presence in the silence. Old pilgrims, stargazers, exiles, each arriving with a wish and leaving behind a silence that widened like a slow-growing wound. On the final wall, behind the lantern, was a small trapdoor carved into the marble floor. I knelt and opened it. The air that rose was colder than any winter wind, a sigh from the undersea vaults, a half-remembered prayer of root and stone. Below lay a shaft of black water, still and infinite, reflecting the lantern's glow back to me with tired longing. I saw my own face in the darkness, gaunt and pale, as though the lantern had burned away my edges. I dared not descend. The water murmured names I almost knew, the names of mothers and children, of unspoken promises, of the star that once shone too close to mortal hearts. It sang of oaths bound in moonlight and broken in silence. I understood then that the wound beneath the stones was bound to this coin, to this lantern, to this unending vigil. Whoever bore the heart of Eärendil was bound to carry its sorrow night after night, the glow a reminder of what cannot be healed. I replaced the coin, my hands heavy as tides. The lantern's light waned, folding into its glass like a breath held too long. On the wall beside me, I noticed fresh runes etched in trembling hands, new pilgrim's marks carved by someone who must have come seeking the same solace, the same broken hope. I closed the trapdoor and turned away, the hush of the lighthouse filling the room like water burbling in a shell. Descending the stairs, I passed through shadows that swelled with absence. The salt blossoms shivered in unseen wind, and I felt their small, persistent grief, 1,000 tiny hearts beating in ruin. Outside, the village lay silent under a sky unmarked by stars, as though someone had wrenched them loose and carried them away to sea. As I stepped from the sand, I heard the lighthouse sigh, its ancient stones settling into themselves, the lantern's glow fading to a single pulse. It was a breath of memory, a question whispered into the dark. Who will carry the star when mine flickers to ash? I pressed my coat closer against the wind and walked away, my own lantern unlit, the coin heavy in the hidden fold of my coat. The night stretched before me like a wound without end, and I did not look back. There are those who say the heart of Eärendil still burns in the lighthouse each night, and that its glow can be seen from the horizon, an ember flickering against the world's sleep. But every story dies in the telling, slipping beneath the waves of memory. And this one remains at most a faint echo, a lullaby of salt and stone, a question folded in shadow, an unfinished prayer for the sorrow that drifts beyond the light. A low fog clung to the brackish fields where once a marsh had thrived, now only fossilized reeds pressed through cracked clay like brittle fingers reaching for a vanished spring. Under the pale hush of morning, the Watcher's Tower stood half-sunk in mud, its circular walls entwined by willow roots that slithered like silent serpents. These roots curled around broken arrow slits, pressed against fractured stones, and wound through the upturned gravestones of those who, long ago, had come to guard this place. Each dawn, the wind sighed through the tower's core, a slow lament that rose and fell like a sorrow too old to voice. I found the tower by following that sigh, stepping through mist so thick it fell away from my cloak in wet beads. The reeds bowed under dew, and I felt the hush of decades settle over my shoulders, as though each blade of grass carried its own secret ache. Inside, the staircase to the battlements had crumbled into a pile of rubble, yet the air above still whispered, with distant echoes. I perched on a fractured ledge where the iron rings for the watchman's lantern had rusted flat. Beneath me, the collapsed stones formed a basin where rainwater pooled, black and glassy as memory itself. I knelt and traced patterns in the water with a trembling finger, ripples that vanished before the next breath of wind could touch them. At the edge of the pool floated a single moth, its wings mottled in ash-gray tones. It drifted in silent circles, dragging faint trails where it had brushed the water. I watched until the moth lifted, spiraling upward to vanish through a hole in the stonework, leaving only a trembling ring that faded like a half-remembered promise. I rose and followed the ruins into a hidden passage choked by lichen. The stones here were slick with a powder of decay, soft as dust in a tomb. I pressed my hand against the wall and felt the faint thrum of old grief vibrating beneath my palm. Somewhere behind that wall lay an inner chamber, a place where the watchmen once laid the bones of those who stayed to the end. None could say what had brought them here, a sacred duty, a cursed enchantment, or a broken oath, but their absence remained, palpable as a bruise. Beyond the passage, an arch opened onto a courtyard strewn with moss and fallen pillars. A circle of elm trees ringed the space, their trunks scarred by symbols weathered nearly to oblivion. In the center grew a hawthorn sapling, bent and stunted, yet crowned with clusters of ghost-white blossoms that pulsed faintly in the fog. The blossoms were cold to the touch, petals like thin paper that fell the moment I brushed them. I crouched beside the sapling and found at its roots a fragment of carved bone, an armlet shaped like intertwining branches, once worn perhaps by a sentinel. The carving was meticulous, every vein and knot rendered with care. Yet a hairline fracture ran through its length, so fine I at first believed it part of the design. When I lifted it, the fracture widened into a yawning fault, and I glimpsed within it a flicker of pale light, as though the sapling's blossoms had bled into the bone. I pressed the armlet against my palm. The light pulsed, a slow, quiet heartbeat, and I felt the tower's sorrow settle into my bones. For a moment, I thought I heard singing, a lullaby woven from wind-borne syllables, a melody for lost children who never reached home. But the mist swallowed the sound before I could catch a single word. Above, the elm branches swayed as though in response. Their leaves whispered in unison, a rumor of old names, watchers, wardens, wraiths. None of these names could I recall. They slipped through my mind like sand. I closed my eyes, and the tree song became the chorus of my own failures, oaths I had broken, promises I had let crumble, hopes I had buried beneath silence. When I opened my eyes, dusk had come again, without warning. The sky was a bleached canvas, the sun a pale bruise on the horizon. Shadows pooled beneath the elm, reaching toward me like dark tendrils. I rose, the armlet heavy in my grasp, and felt the weight of all who had worn it before. Something sacred lay in that weight, a sorrow so deep it might carve itself into living hearts. I left the sapling at the courtyard's edge, stepping into the passage that led back toward the fields. The fog shifted around me, and I could have sworn I felt a presence at my back, watching. Its gaze was invisible as the wind, heavy with expectation. I dared not turn. Outside, the reeds trembled, as though with fear, and the distant marsh gave up its whispered laments. I walked through the gathering gloom, the armlet hidden beneath my coat, its light a pale memory against my chest. Each step felt measured, deliberate, as though the tower's hush had seeped into my gait. That night, I found myself at the shore where the sea licks the black sands, unable to rest. The memory of the hawthorn's blossoms and the buried armlet weighed upon my mind. I watched as phosphorescent algae glimmered in the shallows, tiny sparks drifting in the tide like drowned candle flames clinging to the foam. The water beckoned with a soft, insistent pull, inviting me to release what I carried. Instead, I knelt at the water's edge and pressed my palms into the sand. Salt spray cooled my forehead, and the moon's reflection danced in the shallow pools. In the shimmering light, I saw shapes beneath the surface, skeletal reeds, long sunken driftwood, a single bone-white ring half buried in the silt. It mirrored the armlet in my pocket, and I felt a pinch of fear that two burdens could exist on the same night, each waiting for the other. I withdrew, leaving the bone ring to sink deeper into the dark. When I straightened, a breeze ruffled my hair, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter, a child's laughter, distant and hollow. I blinked against the wind and saw on the lip of the water the faint outline of a small handprint pressed into the wet sand. It was too high above the tide line for any living child to have left it, and the fingers were unnaturally long, as if the hand belonged to something not quite human. A lurch of dread rolled through me, quick and sudden, but the handprint was gone when I knelt to examine it, smoothed away by the next wave, which swallowed the imprint as though it had never been. Only a tremor in the ink-black water remained, a whisper of circles echoing in the sand. I rose with shaking limbs, the night air closing in around me like finality. I tucked the armlet deeper, its light dim but persistent against my ribs. In that moment, I understood that memory and decay were lovers, entwined so tightly that to embrace one was to carry the wound of the other. Here at the edge of the world, between marsh and sea, I held both. Before I left, I turned back once. The tower's silhouette rose against the sky, its broken walls faintly aglow from within. No stars shone above it, and yet the tower's heart pulsed with a borrowed shine, a quiet beacon for those who could not rest. The mist curled around its base, hiding the fields, the elm trees, and the shattered bones within. Somewhere deep inside, the sapling's blossoms stirred, and I thought I heard a sigh that trembled on the wind, a farewell, or perhaps an invitation to return. I walked westward, the tides calling my name in sighs and surges, carrying the taste of salt and sorrow on their tongue. Behind me, the tower's lantern flickered once, as though testing its strength, before melting back into the hush. I did not look again. My path lay under the cover of darkness, guided by a fragile glow I dared not explain, and by the weight of a promise, as broken and beautiful as any lost memory. A dawn chill settled over the drowned grove, where once proud pines had stood, their trunks now rotted pillars rising from knee-deep water. A silent lake had claimed their roots, its mirror surface littered with fallen needles and bright as spilled silver in the pale light. Each ripple dissolved like a sigh, dissolving memories into the vast hush. I drifted into this water-worn cathedral, bare feet skimming the silted floor, drawn by the longing that clung to every broken branch. At the heart of the grove lay an ancient temple, half submerged and half sunken, its arched doorway cracked in two. Moss dripped from its lintels, each strand weighted with dew that gleamed like tears. The stone columns, carved with vine motifs worn nearly smooth, leaned as though bowed by centuries of sorrow. Within them, the air moved in slow spirals, carrying the scent of wet earth and drowned blossoms. No voices spoke here. Even the birds seemed to skirt the edges, keeping vigil in quiet perches beyond sight. I knelt at the temple's threshold, fingertips brushing the water that lapped against the worn stone. In that cold surface, I saw my own reflection, hollowed eyes edged by night's fatigue, and felt the weight of the armlet against my chest, its faint glow pulsing like a wounded heart. Beside me, a moth alighted on a ring of algae, wings tremulous in dawn's hush. It seemed to draw strength from the decay, a living echo of what had passed. Stepping inside, I found the inner sanctum flooded to waist height. The water was clear here, but its depths hid the shapes of broken relics, shattered cups, fragments of bone carved with faded runes, and pottery shards painted with half-remembered symbols. Each piece lay suspended between ruin and remembrance, as if floating in a limbo of unspoken grief. I moved among them, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium, listening to the hollow echo of my breathing. In the center of the chamber stood a stone dais, its surface mottled with age. Atop it lay a single object, a small fluted bowl of black obsidian, its rim chipped like a wounded crown. I approached slowly, water swirling around my ankles, and found inside the bowl a handful of ash-gray petals, fallen from some ghostly blossom that no longer bloomed. They were cool to the touch, thin as parchment, and crumbled at my breath, drifting upward like tiny motes of sorrow. As I gathered the petals in my cupped palm, the silence deepened, pressing against my ears until I thought I could hear the roots of the pines creaking beneath the water. Somewhere beyond the temple walls, a cloud bank rolled across the sky, dimming the dawn's radiance to a sallow glow. Shadows pooled at the base of the columns, as though something long buried had opened its eyes. I let the petals fall back into the water. They swirled in a slow orbit, drawing a ring that spread outward until it brushed the dais and trembled against the stone carvings. In that circle, I saw the faintest shimmer, like the afterimage of a lantern flame, tracing the outlines of letters half erased by time. I knelt, wet sleeves brushing the dais, and tried to discern their shape. Promises made beneath moonlight, prayers offered to gods whose names I no longer knew. The bowl remained empty now, but the dais retained a warmth that pulsed against my palms. I closed my eyes and felt that warmth sink into my veins, stirring something deep where memories slept. Somewhere below, the water bore the weight of countless stories. The watchers who had tended this grove, the pilgrims who once lit candles in its niches, and the mourners who brought offerings here, seeking solace in shared sorrow. When I opened my eyes, the chamber had shifted. The shadows no longer hung inert, but gathered at the corners, pooling into shapes that hovered just beyond sight. I sensed them rather than saw them, silent silhouettes that trembled in the half-light, as though waiting for a story to finish. My breath caught. The hush between heartbeats felt vast, pregnant with unsaid things. I rose and stepped toward the exit, petals drifting alongside me in the water. Each step sent ripples outward, and I watched as they carried the ash fragments across the floor, where they settled upon broken pillars and carved friezes. A single petal drifted to rest on a fallen statue's lap, an offering of absence, a testament to what once lived and what had faded. Outside, the lake lay still again, but the air tasted different now, sharper, as though the world had inhaled and held its breath. The trunks of the drowned pines gleamed in the softened light, their reflections fractured in the water's skin. I lingered on the threshold, feeling the pull of the grove's grief, as though its silent lament sought a voice. At the edge of the water, I found footsteps imprinted on the soft mud, strange impressions that curved like a crescent moon, too large for any human foot. They led from the grove's edge toward the higher ground, vanishing where reeds thickened into marsh. I traced one with my finger, ridges and hollows so clear that I could feel their shape beneath my nail. A chill pricked my skin. I would not follow, yet I could not turn away. In that moment, a distant bell tolled, its note so muted that I barely heard it. Yet it carried through the mist to the temple's walls. The sound quivered in the dawn, as if reluctant to break the silence it had kept for centuries. I stood motionless, listening until the note dissolved into thin air, leaving only the echo of its memory. With the bell's passing, the grove seemed to exhale. The moth lifted from the algae ring and drifted toward the temple's heart, disappearing among the pillars. I bent to gather a shard of pottery from the water, its surface etched with a motif of interlaced vines. When I touched it, the design seemed to shift beneath my fingertips, writhing like an ancient root reaching for life. I withdrew my hand, heart pounding with a sorrow I could not name. I pressed the shard to my lips, tasting the whisper of rain and moss. Then I pressed it to my chest, alongside the armlet and the ash petals I still carried. They formed a fragile constellation, 3 relics of ruin, each pulsing with a faint light that spoke of broken hopes. I closed my eyes, feeling their weight settle like stone upon my soul. Dusk fell before I left the grove. The sky blushed with a farewell glow, and the drowned pines' silhouettes darkened against a trembling horizon. The water's surface caught the last rays of sun, then dimmed to inky black. I walked away, the 3 relics hidden beneath layers of cloth, and felt the grove's sorrow trailing behind me like a wisp of mist. That night, I camped near a ruined causeway where water had cracked the stone into jagged teeth. Fireflies hovered above the broken path, their lights flickering in patterns too deliberate to be chance. I watched them in silence, imagining they carried messages between the living and the drowned. Each flicker felt like a vow that memory endures, even in decay. When sleep claimed me, I dreamed of voices woven from reeds, half-uttered prayers, lullabies for ghosts, and the infinite echo of footsteps that crossed the water so long ago. I awoke with the taste of damp earth on my tongue and a single ash petal on my pillow, no doubt fallen from my coat in the night. I rose before dawn, the bell's faint echo still humming in my bones. The grove lay behind me, hidden by distance and mist, yet I carried its silence within me. 3 relics rested against my heart, each one a shard of longing and a wound unhealed. I did not know what journey lay ahead, but I understood that every step would draw me deeper into the realm of forgotten things, where grief and grace entwine like vines on ancient stone. The sky above was pale, and the wind held a question for which neither prayers nor lanterns would ever supply an answer. Yet I pressed on, guided by the soft glow of what remained unbroken within the shards I bore, and by the hush that follows sorrow, ever waiting to be spoken once more. Mist-laden dawn draped the weeping fen in a muted veil, where waterlogged paths wound between skeletal willows that bowed under centuries of sorrow. Their gnarled roots surfaced in shallow pools like arthritic fingers seeking purchase, and their branches carried moss that dripped like half-forgotten tears. Each step I took pressed a hush into the mud, and the air tasted of decay and distant bells, as though the peat itself had absorbed old lamentations. At the heart of the fen lay a ruined chapel, its walls breached by time and tide. Granite blocks, slick with algae and stained by rain, formed buttresses that leaned at odd angles, as if giving way beneath the weight of unspoken grief. The roof had long since collapsed, leaving only fragments of timber and a single rusted cross slung askew over the altar. Within, the floor was flooded ankle-deep, the water dark and still, littered with petals that had drifted down from some unseen blossom. I entered through a fractured archway, careful to disturb neither slime nor shellfish that glimmered beneath the surface. The hush inside was profound. No bird, no breeze, no betraying echo of movement. In the sanctuary's center, I found the coffin of black oak wedged beneath a half-collapsed vault. Its lid was carved with a tree whose branches curled inward, encircling an empty space where fruit should have been. That void felt cavernous in the dim light, as though the tree had been robbed of its heart. Fingers trembling, I traced the carving's curves. The wood was splintered in places, and around each fissure grew clusters of pale fungus, luminescent in the gloom. They clung to the grain like memory to bone, soft and insistent, pushing their roots into the coffin's crevices. One tendril brushed my palm, cool and tender, and I flinched as though I had touched the edge of a wound. Beside the coffin lay a tarnished chalice of tarnished bronze, its foot engraved with a constellation of dots and lines. I leaned over and peered inside, expecting water, but found only a smooth stone, dark as midnight and heavy in my hand. Its surface was etched with a single rune that glowed faintly with the residue of something once living. When I pressed the stone to my ear, I imagined I heard the echo of chanted prayers, carried on waves of water and decay. A hush settled on the chapel, deepening until the fungus's faint glow seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I placed the runestone atop the coffin's lid, as though offering it back to the silent sentinel within. The fungus shivered, and a few spores drifted upward in the still air, like pale breaths released from a halted voice. Above me, the fractured vault framed a ragged slice of sky. The sun, a wan bruise in the clouded dome, shed a thin shaft of light that fell upon the chalice. In that moment, I thought I saw the pattern on its footshift, the dots and lines forming a path, a journey from star to star, or perhaps from life to unlife. The runestone glowed brighter in my palm, illuminating the fungus's filigree until the air itself seemed luminous with half-seen shapes. I lingered, torn between yielding to the chapel's hush and the urge to flee its oppressive stillness. Yet I could not turn away. Instead, I knelt and lifted the runestone, the fungus quivering beneath my fingertips. I tucked it into my coat alongside the pottery shard and the ash petals from the drowned grove. 3 relics now lay against my chest, each humming with some echo of ancient sorrow. The willows outside swayed, as though stirred by a breath, and I sensed movement at the threshold. I rose, water rippling at my ankles, and peered into the murk. A shape, tall and slender, stood just beyond the arch, draped in wet fabric that clung like skin. Its face was hidden beneath a hood of thick moss, and its hands were folded before it, dripping peat. I held my breath, expecting it to speak, but it remained silent, as though mourning its own form. Then, as softly as a sigh, It turned away and vanished into the fen. I watched until the willow's reflection rippled, leaving no trace of its passage. The silence that followed felt laden, as though the chapel itself had exhaled a wound too heavy to bear. I stepped back onto the rough path, the water sloshing around my boots, and looked down at the runestone in my hand. Its glow was a soft pulse against the hush of decay, as though it sought to remind me of something lost beyond recall. I pressed it to my lips and felt an echo of wind-blown voices, half drowned by sorrow. That evening, I found shelter beneath the leaning timbers of an old boathouse at the fen's edge. Its planks were barnacled and salt-stained, and inside a small pool of water reflected the chapel's cross in perfect inversion. I lit a small lantern, its flame careful and unhurried, and laid my 3 relics at its base. Their faint lights merged in the amber glow, forming a constellation of broken hopes. I stared at them through the night, listening to the slow drip of water from the rafters. Each drop fell like a heartbeat, measured in grief, marking time in a place where time had long ceased to mean anything. The runestone's glow steadied, the pottery shards' etchings gleamed, and the ash petals whispered in the gloom, as though eager to share their stories. In the hush of midnight, I dreamed of that moss-cloaked figure, walking between tombstones that rose from water as old as memory. Its footsteps were silent ripples, and each stride left a blossom at its heel, pale petals that opened to reveal empty blooms. I reached out to catch one, but my hand passed through it like smoke. The blossom floated toward the chapel, drifting through the broken arch, and I watched until it lay upon the coffin's lid, dissolving into ash. I woke before dawn, the lantern's flame guttering low. The boathouse smelled of wet oak and peat, and the relics lay unchanged. Outside, the wind sighed through the weeping willows, and I knew I could not linger. I folded my coat around the runestone, slid the shard into a pocket, and pressed the ash petals between the pages of my journal, 3 delicate imprints of sorrow. Stepping back into the fen, I paused at the chapel's threshold one last time. The black oak coffin's tree carving was half obscured by fallen timbers, and the fungus had retreated into the cracks. The chalice lay empty, its bronze foot cold and silent. Yet beneath the water, I thought I saw the runestone's glow beneath the dais, as if yearning to return. I turned away, boots deep in the soft mud, and walked towards the distant reeds that quivered in morning light. In the hush beyond the chapel, I felt the presence of unseen watchers, the moss-hooded figure, the willows, the ghosts of pilgrims whose hopes lay buried in the peat. Their silence trailed me like a prayer unfinished. As I left the weeping fen behind, the chapel's arch framed the sky once more, a slash of grey against the mist. I did not look back, but I carried its hush within me, folded into the relics at my breast. Each carried a fragment of grief, the rune that heard prayers unspoken, the shard that bore the imprint of root and vine, and the petals born of water and ash. The path ahead wound through fields of dark reeds and shallow streams, their waters thick with half-seen shapes. I walked with measured steps, guided by the relic's faint glow, and by the hush that follows sorrow wherever it settles. Beyond the reeds, the world waited, its wounds unhealed, its stories half told, and I pressed onward, burdened and blessed by the weight of memory, ever seeking the light that glimmers at the heart of decay. A slate-grey dawn broke over the orchard of withered boughs, where ancient apple trees stood like silent sentinels in a sea of brittle grasses. Their limbs were gnarled and knotted, as though twisted by ceaseless mourning, and between their roots lay decaying fruit, half hidden by moss that glimmered with dew. No birds sang here, only the faint sigh of wind threading through hollow branches, a sound that felt more like sorrow than breeze. I entered the orchard by a crumbling stone wall, its mortar leached by rain and time. The stones were mottled with lichen in ghostly patterns, pale green and ivory sprawlings that resembled veins drawn across living skin. Each step forward pressed through fallen leaves, their edges curled and brown, releasing a faint sweetness that mingled with the damp earth. It was the perfume of something once vibrant, now surrendered to rot. Beneath the largest apple tree, the one whose trunk split into twin pillars, I found a hollow where the roots curled like the fingers of a buried hand. Inside that carved nook lay a shard of silvered glass, its edge smooth despite the years it must have known. The fragment reflected the orchard's empty sky, a shuttered gaze offering a distorted echo of reality. I knelt and picked it up, wincing as a sliver of chill seeped into my palm. The shard's surface rippled with age, and when I tilted it, I saw not only the orchard, but also fleeting glimpses of other places I had been. The lighthouse's broken lantern, the drowned tower's sapling, the temple's obsidian bowl, the fen's runestone. In each reflection, I appeared as a hollow figure, eyes sunken, shoulders bowed, as though the land had absorbed my shape. For a heartbeat, I wondered if the shard held my truest likeness, a reflection crafted from memory rather than flesh. I pressed the glass to my chest, its weight a sharp reminder of the relics already there: coin, armlet, petals, shard, runestone, and now this mirror fragment, all cradled against my heart. The orchard seemed to lean toward me, its branches creaking in a hushed chorus, as though urging me to look deeper into the glass's depths. I hesitated, then raised it to eye level and gazed into its warped sheen. In the shimmer, the orchard's decay became alive. I saw blossoms unfurl in reverse, petals rising from the ground to rejoin dying branches. I saw rot spin backward into bloom, and leaves reconstruct themselves in slow motion, knitting themselves whole again. And beneath it all, a dark fissure opened, an absence that pulsed like a wound in the glass's heart. No matter how I shifted the shard, that void remained, anchored at its core. I lowered the shard, blurring the orchard's reflections into muted shapes. A single fallen apple lay at my feet, half submerged in a pool of rainwater. Its skin was mottled with fungus, and when I touched it, the surface crumbled, releasing an amber liquid that seeped into the earth. I watched until the pool's edge spread, carrying the juice across the stone wall's base, as though the orchard were bleeding its own sorrow. A hush fell, deeper than before. The apple tree's branches swayed, and I thought I heard a faint creak, like the groan of timber under strain. Looking up, I saw the silhouette of a broken swing, its ropes frayed and knotted, hanging from a high branch. No child's laughter had filled these woods in ages, yet the swing swung once, hesitantly, before swinging still again, as though moved by a longing I could not name. The shard pulsed softly in my cloak pocket. I knew the glass would remember whatever it saw. Its surface could store whispers of the world long after flesh had faded. I stood and approached the swing, heart thudding, each step deliberate. Beneath the seat lay a scattering of seed casings, tiny domes of bone-white hulls, emptied and hushed. I gathered one, its hollow dome echoing faintly when pressed to my ear. The orchard exhaled in the wind, and the seed casing slipped from my fingers to the ground. In its fall, I thought I heard a sigh of release. as though something held aloft at last had found rest. I knelt to retrieve the casing, but before my hand closed around it, a swirl of ash drifted through the air, circling the swing's ropes like an invisible breath. The ropes frayed further, splinters of wood detaching and falling to the grass. I stepped back, shaken, and felt the shard's weight against my heart. It seemed to tremble, humming with the orchard's decay. I reached into my coat and drew it out again, pressing its cool face against my palm. The reflections flickered. Now, in the glass, I saw the orchard's twisted trees transform into a procession of fallen figures, pilgrims or children, each carrying a lantern like the one from the lighthouse. They moved in single file through the branches, their steps leaving rings of withered petals on the ground. I blinked and the image dissolved. The orchard returned to silent ruin, but the air thrummed with the memory of movement. I folded the shard carefully, wrapping it in a scrap of linen torn from my coat. I tucked it into my coat alongside the other relics, their combined weight a ballast of sorrow against my chest. The sun dipped toward noon, and a shaft of light pierced the orchard's gloom, illuminating the swing's rope as if spotlighting a ghost. In that light, I saw the wood was not oak or ash, but the bone-white wood of old willows, trees that once stood in the fen, their sap lost to the dissolved water. I realized the swing had been fashioned from that wood, carried here by hands I could no longer trace. A breeze moved through the orchard, stirring the grasses into gentle waves. In the rustle, I heard a name I could not place, a child's name, soft as a breeze that caresses a cheek. The sound brushed against my mind and vanished, leaving only the hollow echo of its passing. I felt tears sting my eyes, tears for the orchard's dying, tears for the child whose name I could not keep. I turned away from the swing and walked towards the wall's opening. Each step carried me deeper into the orchard's collapse. Rotten apples, bent trunks, collapsed nests. The grasses parted to reveal a shallow trench lined with stone, perhaps an irrigation channel, now dry and choked with silt. At its bottom lay a small wooden box bound in rope. Its planks were swollen with moisture, but the rope held firm, knotted in a pattern I recognized from the sapling's armlet. I knelt and unbound one end of the rope, feeling the fibers yield under my fingers. Inside the box lay a torn fragment of parchment, its edges darkened by damp, ink blurred into watery smudges. I lifted it with care and flattened it against my palm. Upon it were half-formed letters, scribbles of a language I almost knew. Each stroke weighted with longing. Only one word remained legible. Remember. I closed my eyes, and the orchard's hush settled around me like a benediction. The relics pressed against my chest, and I took a breath that trembled with every memory I had gathered. The lighthouse and its coin, the tower's sapling and armlet, the temple's petals and pottery shard, the chapel's runestone, and now this shard of glass and this fragment of parchment. Each held a fragment of a story, and each story spoke of absence and longing. When I opened my eyes, the orchard had shifted. The swing lay motionless, the trench lay empty once more, and the fragment of parchment slipped from my hand to rest on the damp grass. I did not retrieve it. Instead, I rose and approached the stone wall's gap, pausing at its threshold. Behind me, the orchard sighed, a wind through hollow branches, a lament carried on cold air. I stepped through the gap, leaving the orchard's sorrow in my wake. At my shoulder, the shard of glass pulsed softly, as if reluctant to follow. I tucked it deeper into my coat and walked on, guided by the weight of so many memories and the fragile hope that stitched them together. Beyond the wall, the world awaited. Fields of cracked earth and deserted paths, each harboring its own hushed laments. But I carried the orchard's ending within me, a testament to the beauty of decay, the tenderness of memory, and the promise that remnants of the past could still guide the living through the hush of night. A pale light drifted down through a fissure in the rock, spilling onto the moss-slick floor of the whispering cavern. Stalactites hung like icicles of stone, each one studded with lichen that glimmered faintly in the hush. The air was cool and damp, as though the earth itself exhaled a slow, breathless sigh. Tiny rivulets of water traced silver threads across the cave walls, carving paths through mineral stains that resembled ancient runes. I followed the light to a shallow pool nestled against a low ledge, its surface perfectly still. Beneath the water lay a single bone, bleached by time and smoothed by countless years of drifting. It was the metacarpal of a hand, delicate and slender, and it held a whisper of movement as my shadow passed over it. I knelt beside the pool, pressing my fingertips to the water's lip, and felt the faintest tremor beneath the glassy skin. On the ledge above, gathered in a curve of stone, lay the relics I had carried. The tarnished coin, the silver armlet, the obsidian petals, the rune stone, the pottery shard, the mirror fragment, and the fragment of parchment. Each one glowed with its own subdued light, and together they formed a constellation of sorrow that pulsed against my chest. I lifted them one by one, running each across my palm and returning it to the ledge, as though letting them breathe in this cavern's hush. When at last I turned to the pool again, the bone had shifted. Where its curve once lay flat, it now arched toward me, pointing like a silent finger. I could not say whether the water had moved it or whether some unseen hand had guided it. I pressed my palm to the stone and felt the cave's heartbeat beneath me, slow, echoing, as though it measured time in centuries rather than breaths. I emptied my coat of the relics and set them in a circle around the pool. In the center, I placed the mirror fragment, its glass face turned skyward so that the sliver of sunlight would strike it. The shard caught the light and cast a thin beam across the water, illuminating the bone until it glowed like bone set aflame. The pool's surface rippled, and I saw there not only the bone, but also my own reflection, drawn tight with longing, eyes rimmed in exhaustion. I knelt and retrieved the bone, lifting it from the water with reverence. Its surface was cool and worn, and I traced its length until I found a faint inscription, a single rune carved so lightly it might have been a crease of age in the grain. It matched the runestone's mark. When I pressed the bone to my ear, I heard the echo of distant bells, as though a monastery lay buried somewhere beyond the cavern, offering a half-remembered chant. Above, the lichen trembled. Fine spores drifted downward, landing on the relics in a slow snowfall of pale dust. I closed my eyes and felt their touch, soft as a lover's sigh, carrying the scent of stone and rot. Each speck settled onto metal, glass, and bone, binding them anew to this silent realm. Slowly, I laid the bone beside the runestone, aligning the carved runes so they faced each other. Between them, I set the pottery shard, its vine motif pointing inward. The whirlwind of relics now formed a sacred triad: bone, rune, and vine, each speaking of decay and memory. I circled them with the petals, letting the hung, ash-gray blossoms drift until they settled in a meadow of fragility. At the cave mouth, a wind stirred, a breath from the world outside that carried the scent of pine and distant rain. The beam of sunlight shifted, tracing the curve of the bone and finally resting upon the parchment fragment. I knelt to retrieve it, but found the letters had shifted in the night. Remember, now spelled renounce. The change was subtle, a blot of ink woven into the fibers, yet it struck me like a fault opening beneath my feet. My pulse slowed as I pondered the new word. Renounce, to let go, to release what cannot be saved. I pressed the fragment to my lips and tasted damp ink and time. Then I tucked it into the hollow of the bone, binding them together in a gesture both sacramental and sorrowful. Behind me, the cave darkened as the sun drifted from the fissure. The relics lay cool in their circle, waiting. A hush deepened into silence, and I heard the drip of water from the stalactites, each drop a soft punctuation in the cavern's vast hush. I closed my eyes and let the silence wash over me, as one might drown in absence. When I opened them again, the lichen's glow had receded, leaving only a faint trace of phosphorescence along the walls. I rose and stepped towards the pool's edge, bone and relics concealed beneath my coat. The water's reflection wavered, and I saw not only the shard of light, but a sense of movement within its depths, shapes coalescing, then dissolving. A hand reaching, a lantern swinging, a face turned away. A whisper rose from the pool, so soft I first believed it my own breath. Then it grew into a song, half-formed words that brushed against the cave's walls like gentle currents. Renounce the weight you bear. Let the fissure mend. Release the coin, the armlet, the blossom. I folded my coat and removed the tarnished coin. Its surface was dull, its star motif nearly worn away. In the candlelight of memory, I had once thought this coin bore the glow of a broken star. Now it felt like a burden, an anchor holding me to the forgotten. With a trembling hand, I tossed it into the pool. The water embraced it, and it sank in silence, bubbles rising like lost prayers. Beside me, the bone parchment talisman pulsed faintly, and I pressed it to my lips once more before slipping it back into my pocket. I would carry this renunciation with me, a compact vow to unburden my soul. As for the other relics, I would decide in time which to keep and which to leave behind. I turned away from the pool and made my way deeper into the cavern, guided by the echo of dripping water. The walls narrowed and the floor rose, leading to a small chamber carved by human hands, long dissolved by history. There, set into the rock, was a shallow alcove lined with rusted iron rings. Centuries ago, it must have held lamps or offerings. Now it bore only spider silken webs and a thin layer of dust. I placed the pottery shard in the alcove, its vine motif curling into the stone's grain, as though rooting itself once more. Above it, I hung the silver armlet from one of the rings, letting it dangle like a broken halo. The lichen dust settled on both, flecking them with the cavern's memory. Next, I laid the runestone beside the vine, its surface dark, except for the carved symbol. Then, I placed the obsidian petals in the alcove's corner, their ashen forms a memorial to what had bloomed and withered here. Lastly, I tucked the mirror fragment into a crevice at the alcove's back, its glass hidden, but still able to capture the faintest glimmer of passing light. When I stepped back, the alcove looked like an altar to absence. The relics no longer pressed against my heart, but remained here, bound to the cavern's hush. I took a breath that trembled with relief and sorrow, feeling the weight of years unravel in the stillness. From my coat, I withdrew the bone parchment talisman and laid it on the altar's lip. One small act of renunciation followed by another. Words bound within bone, now offered back to the earth. The runestone's glow pulsed once, then dimmed, and I heard the cave sigh, as though exhaling a long-held grief. I turned to leave, my footsteps silent on the moss-soft ground. At the threshold, I paused and looked back. The alcove's relics gleamed in the half-light, a constellation of decay and remembrance nestled within the rock. Behind them, the cavern stretched into darkness, infinite and unspoken. With one last glance, I slipped away into the fading shaft of light. The fissure above blinked closed, and the cavern's hush returned, deeper than before. Outside, the world awaited. Rain-kissed earth and wind-torn trees, fields ripe with memory and decay. I stepped into the light, my heart unburdened, yet heavy with what remained, and walked on beneath a sky of morning clouds. A hush lay over the dry fall gorge, where once a river thundered over a lip of basalt, now silent and choked by centuries of fallen stones. The canyon's walls, slick with emerald moss, rose steep and unyielding against a sky bleached by dust. At its base, a shallow basin of cracked earth held only a thin sheen of rainwater, in whose surface the broken stones of the ancient falls seemed to drift like ghosts. I entered the gorge at dawn's grey edge, each footstep echoing in the emptiness. The air tasted of limestone and old drought. Even the moss exhaled a brittle sorrow. Here, the torrent's memory lay buried beneath layers of sediment, its roar reduced to a tremor under the soles of my boots. I breathed slowly, letting the canyon's silence wrap around me like a heavy cloak. At the furthest bend, hidden in a tangle of lichen and root, I found a narrow stair carved into the basalt. Its edges were blunted by time, each step festooned with dew-wet moss that yielded beneath my weight. I descended until the roar of memory grew faint beneath the hush, until the outside world receded into a thin line of sky overhead. Below, a chamber opened, a vaulted cave hollowed by water long vanished. Stalactites dripped a single drop of moisture into a stone basin at its center, each blink a small statement of time. On the basin's rim lay the bone parchment talisman, its inked letters and carved rune glimmering in the pale light. I knelt and retrieved it, noting that the word renounce had softened on the parchment, as though the cave's damp breath had coaxed it back toward remember. I pressed the fragment to my lips and shut my eyes. A faint rustle sounded in the darkness, loose gravel shifting, or perhaps the sigh of the cavern settling. When I opened my eyes, I saw beside the basin the glint of metal, the silver armlet, its filigree darkened by tarnish, and the pottery shard, vine motif still curled with life's echo. The runestone lay nearby, its carved symbol dim in the gloom, and clusters of obsidian petals floated on the basin's shallow pool. I gathered them all, laying each upon a flat slab of basalt that served as an altar. The shard and armlet leaned together like old sentinels. The runestone nestled against the bone and parchment, the petals scattered like pale confessions around their feet. The mirror fragment I placed at the altar's edge, its polished side reflecting the dripping stalactites above, tying the relics to the chamber's vaulted ceiling. A single drop fell into the basin, and ripples spread until they brushed the relic's circle. In the wavering reflections, I thought I saw the canyon above awaken in reverse. Stones rising, water filling the gorge, the dry fall roaring once more into life. But the vision shredded before me, leaving only the hush of empty air and the slow drip of stone tears. I pressed my palm to the basalt beside the altar. The rock was cool and damp, ridged with veins of mineral that glowed faintly, like buried veins of sorrow. Beneath my fingertips, I felt the pulse of the earth's memory, weak, hesitant, as though it recognized each relic's story and whispered its own in response. I tasted the air, stone dust and lichen, a breath older than wood or bone. The air shifted and I became aware of another presence, something formless, deep in the cave's shadows. I did not turn. Instead, I let my vision settle on the relics. The armlet's silver glimmered, and I thought I saw tiny reflections race across its surface, like sparrows fleeing a faltering dawn. The runestone symbol pulsed once, a heartbeat in granite silence. The mirror fragment caught the drip's glint, a pinprick of starlight in subterranean dusk, and the bone parchment talisman lay folded, its word hovering between renounce and remember, as though torn between letting go and holding fast. I lifted the pottery shard and pressed its vine motif into the stone beside the basin, embedding it in the rock's moss-lined scars. The vines on the shard entwined with mineral streaks, binding the clay's memory to the basalts. I stepped back and placed the shard's mate, the mirror fragment opposite, reflecting the vine's tendrils into infinite loops. Between them, I laid the armlet, its circle sealed by the runestone's carved sign. The arrangement felt sacred, a grove of relics rooted in stone. I knelt and gathered a handful of obsidian petals, dark and weightless, and let them drift like silent leaves around the altar. Each petal fluttered in the thin current that stirred the cave's air, brushing against the relics before coming to rest. One landed atop the runestone, its ash-grey form contrasting with the dark symbol beneath. A hush deepened, as though the chamber itself leaned into witness. The drip ceased, the echo faded, and only the faint hum of the earth remained. I closed my eyes and listened. The pulse of stone, the sigh of moss, the whisper of memory woven into every relic. It was a symphony of absence, a lullaby for what had been lost and what had not yet been found. When I opened my eyes, the altar's circle had shifted. The runestone now stood upright in the basin, half submerged, its symbol half lit by the pale glow of lichen veins. The armlet lay beside it, its curve matching the rune's form. The shards of pottery and mirror leaned against each other like twin wings, and the bone parchment talisman drifted towards the basin's edge, as though drawn by the rune's silent call. A cool gust swirled around me, stirring the relics. The basin's water rippled outward, carrying each piece in a slow orbit. Rune, armlet, shard, mirror, talisman. The obsidian petals traced their own patterns on the water's skin, ghost-white watchers riding the current. I felt a tug in my chest, as though the circle's harmony called to something buried within my bones. I rose and stepped towards the basin. The runestone glowed brighter now, its symbol etched in pale light. I reached down and lifted it, bringing it to my mouth. The rune's edges were warm against my lips, as though imprinted by a breath longer than any human life. When I pressed it there, I heard a voice in the hollow of my skull. Soft syllables spoken in a language older than memory, a vow to bind sorrow and hope in the same exhalation. The basin trembled and water splashed up, sending droplets racing along the cave's walls. The lichen glowed in response, veins igniting in pale luminescence. Shadows danced across the basalt ceiling, and I saw shapes move among the stalactites, branches rising to reclaim the cavern, roots descending to cradle the relics. I withdrew the runestone and felt its glow fade beneath my cloak. The basin stilled, and the lichen's light dimmed. In the aftermath, the silence felt deeper than before, as though the cave had swallowed its own voice, I knelt and gathered each relic in turn. First, the bone parchment talisman, folded into the hollow of my hand. Then the armlet, nestled beside it. Next, the mirror fragment, its glass cool and hard. And finally, the pottery shard, its vine motif tracing the line of my palm. Only the basin remained, carved and empty, its echoes spent. I turned and ascended the basalt steps, relics held close, the cave's breath fading behind me. Each step felt lighter than the last, as though the gorgeous sorrows had been filtered through stone and lichen, leaving only the quiet grace of renunciation. At the canyon's rim, the sky was pale with coming dusk. The dry fall gorge yawned beneath me, its walls folded into shadows. I paused, the relics resting against my chest, and let the open air fill my lungs. The wind rattled through the moss, carrying the taste of distant rain and sunlit dust. The gorgeous silence lay at my feet, and I felt its ancient hush settle around my soul. I turned away from the precipice and walked along the rim, each footstep a soft imprint in the dust. The relics lay silent against my heart, their burdens lightened by the altar's renunciation. Behind me, the gorge held its memory in basalt veins, a deep well of absence that would endure long after my passing. As the last light faded, I carried the relics forward, bone and parchment, armlet and shard, mirror and rune, toward the world beyond the gorge's rim. Between memory and decay, I bore their stories in hushed cadence, stepping into the dusk with a heart unburdened, yet bound by the echo of ancient grief. The kiln stood silent at the edge of the burnt grove, its brick arch yawning black against a sky smeared with ash. Once, it must have glowed with ember and flame, shaping clay into vessels that held water, wine, and grain. Now its walls were mottled with soot and lichen, the mortar crumbling like phantom dust beneath each breath of wind. I stepped beneath the arch and felt the hush of loss drape around my shoulders, a weight woven from silence and memory. Inside, the air was cool and yet carried a faint scent of scorched earth. The floor was strewn with shattered shards of pots, their broken rims inscribed with fingerprints that time had weakened into pale smudges. I knelt among them, letting my fingertips trace the patterns, a spiral here, a knotwork motif there, each a testament to hands that once coaxed life from clay. The fragments felt fragile as moth wings, and I gathered a single piece, its curve still smooth, and tucked it into my coat. Beyond the kiln's core, alcoves lined the walls, each once holding a mold or a tool. In one lay a twisted iron tong, its prongs fused by heat, rusted into a single mass like an overgrown root. I lifted it with care, marveling at how the metal bore its scars, a record of fire's embrace and the slow corrosion that followed. At its base, a ring of white fungus had claimed the stone, its papery petals arching like silent supplicants. I brushed a fingertip across the fungus and watched a strand drift to the floor, dissolving into a fine flurry of dust. A shaft of light fell through a crack in the roof, illuminating a low bench carved from basalt. On this bench lay the relics I carried: the bone parchment talisman, the silver armlet, the mirror shard, the pottery shard of vines, and the rune stone whose symbol glowed faintly in the dim. I approached and placed the iron tong beside them, forging an altar of what remained: flesh and bone, metal and clay, obsidian and ink. The kiln's embrace felt whole around me, as though it recognized each relic as a fragment of its own story. I knelt and lifted the pottery shard of vines, tracing the carving until it felt warm against my palm. The ember-gray fungus trembled in the bench's curve, and I thought I heard a faint rustle. like pages turning in a book left open for a century. When I set the shard down, a few flakes of soot drifted onto its surface, and I imagined they melted into the clay's memory, a dark accent to its pale relief. The mirror shard caught the light next, reflecting not only the kiln's interior, but also a distant scene, a riverbank strewn with autumn leaves, their edges curled in firelight. The image shifted as I moved, revealing instead a rain-soaked courtyard where puddles held the reflection of a lone column. In its depth, I saw my own face flicker, hollowed cheeks, eyes ringed with questions. I lowered the shard and let the reflected world recede. Above, the arch's bricks formed perfect concentric rings, each layer a chapter of time. I rested my palm against one, feeling the coarse texture and the faint warmth from the day's last sun. In that touch, I sensed not movement, but the lingering pulse of creation, a fire that once roared, now buried beneath stone and ash. I closed my eyes and let the kiln's silence settle into me, as though I were inheriting its quiet vigil. When I opened my eyes, the rune stone had rolled from its place and rested at the kiln's threshold, its symbol aligned with the arch's curve. I stepped forward and knelt to retrieve it, noting that its glow had brightened in the kiln's hush. The carved sign felt warm against my palm, resonant with an unspoken vow. I tucked it back into my coat alongside the other relics and let the kiln's memory settle around me. A tremor of wind ruffled the fungus, and I turned to see the roof's fissure widen slightly, admitting motes of ash that drifted like tiny flames. They hovered in the light shaft before settling on the bench and the scattered remnants. My breath caught, for I felt as though the kiln were breathing its own grief into the air, a lament carried on motes of memory. I rose and circled the bench, touching each relic in turn. The armlet's silver caught the ash, its tarnished surface glowing with faint resistance. The bone parchment talisman lay folded beside the pottery shard, its inked letters whispering between renounce and remember. The mirror shard and the runestone stood as twin apertures, one into reflection, one into symbol. I hesitated, then lifted the armlet and hung it upon a protruding brick, its open circle, echoing the arch above. Next, I laid the talisman atop the broken pottery shards on the bench, smoothing its edges against the clay's cold curves. The inked word seemed to shift once more beneath my touch, wavering between script and stain. I closed my eyes and breathed out, imagining each letter dissolving into the kiln's silence, leaving only the bone's cool surface. The mirror shard I wedged into a crack in the wall, so that its reflective face peered into the kiln's deepest darkness. In that position, it caught the dying light, scattering it in fractured beams that danced across the soot-stained bricks. I placed the pottery shard beside it, aligning the vine motif to appear as if it crept toward the reflection within. Lastly, I set the runestone into a hollow in the bench, nestling it among the fungus petals that arched above. Its symbol pulsed faintly, and I felt a warmth in the stone that spoke of buried fires and long smothered embers. The circle of relics stood complete. Bone and ink, metal and clay, glass and stone, each bound to the kiln's collapse and the grove's end. I stepped back and watched as the kiln exhaled once more. An invisible breath that stirred the fungus, rattled the mirror's light, and sent a few ashes dancing across the bench. The hush that followed felt profound, as though the kiln had claimed its relics in a silent oath to remember what had passed through its flame. At the kiln's mouth, the grove beyond lay charred and still. Blackened stumps rose like gravestones, and the ground was carpeted with ash-crusted leaves. I paused at the threshold and felt the kiln's absence settle beneath my skin, a wound hollowed by flame, soot, and sorrow. Then I turned away, leaving the kiln's vigil to its metal and clay, its glass and bone. Outside, the world waited under a sky heavy with dusk. The burned trees exhaled only stillness, and the air tasted of embers long cold. I walked through the grove, each footstep stirring motes of ash into the waning light. The relics in my coat felt lighter now, hollowed of their burden, yet still pulsing with the kiln's quiet flame. As the grove gave way to open heath, I paused to look back. The kiln's arch stood framed by skeletal branches, its rim stark against the ash-slate sky. No ember glowed within, yet I sensed its memory burning still, an eternal fire held in granite silence. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the relics rest there, each a promise that no flame, however fierce, could fully consume what must be remembered. With the kiln's hush echoing behind me, I turned towards the heath's barren expanse, guided by the relic's faint light and the hush that follows sorrow wherever it settles. Each step carried me deeper into the night's embrace, where memory and decay entwine, and the final embers of old fires glow in the heart of silence. A hollow hush welcomed me at the threshold of the sunken scriptorium, where jade-green water pooled beneath. Collapsed rafters and driftwood lay stalled like shipwrecked skeletons of trees. Pale motes of light filtered through gaps in the ceiling, illuminating the salty mist that curled about broken desks and walls covered in peeling parchment. The air was heavy with the scent of damp vellum and rot, as though each page exhaled a slow, centuries-long sigh. I stepped over a fallen beam and found myself among rows of overturned lecterns, their iron brackets twisted by rot and tide. Beneath them, manuscripts lay scattered, folios whose ink had bled into river-dark stains, rendering ancient words indecipherable. I knelt beside one fragment, its edges softened by water, and brushed away a layer of silt to reveal letters etched in trembling calligraphy. The phrase, half gone, read like a fragment of prayer, "In the light we are bound." Its tail had dissolved into a smear of sepia, leaving only ellipsis and longing. A slender column of water flowed through the center of the scriptorium, winding among the desks like a fractured vein. I followed its course to a sunken dais, where a nearly intact lectern stood, propped by a stack of waterlogged tomes. Their covers were carved with interlaced patterns, knots unraveling, roots retracting into splintered bark. I lifted one carefully, its spine collapsing in my hands, and found inside a single page protected by waxed cloth. The cloth still held its sheen, but where it touched the page, the ink had faded to ghostly gray. I extracted the page and pressed it to my chest, feeling the delicate fibers yield beneath my palm. The words felt like breath, held too long, a silent vow against oblivion. I lingered there, chest heaving with someone else's memory, until the water lapping at my boots reminded me of the tide beyond these walls. Turning, I surveyed the scriptorium's corners. In one, a carved niche held a lantern of alabaster, its glass gone, but the metal filigree intact. Rust formed filigree of its own around the ribs, and I plucked a flake, tasting iron and salt on my tongue. The lantern's base was scored with symbols, crescent moons entwined with filaments of root that pulsed faintly with something like residual longing. I carried the page and the lantern's base toward a mosaic floor at the scriptorium's heart. The tiles, once jeweled in lapis and jasper, were now marbled in cracks and moss. In the center, the design formed a wheel, spokes of ink-dark tiles radiating from a ring of pale stone. I placed the page in the wheel's core and set the lantern base beside it, aligning the filigree's curve with one of the spokes. Above me, the rafters groaned in response, and a shard of roof tumbled into the pool, sending ripples that carried ink-smudged fragments across the floor. One fragment floated to the wheel's rim and lodged against the lantern base. I bent to retrieve it, a small blot of vellum inscribed with a solitary rune matching the one carved on the runestone I had carried for so long. The sight of it startled me, as though the scriptorium recognized my burden and offered reprieve. I pressed my palm to the mosaic, feeling the chill of the stone seep into my bones. The wheel's pattern radiated in my pulse. Memories cycle, decay's inevitability, and the promise of renewal whispered through rot. I closed my eyes and let the hush of drowned pages settle around me, a lullaby of words we could no longer speak. Opening my eyes, I saw a shape drift at the edge of the water's reach, a torn fragment of cloth, perhaps once a scribe's robe, caught on a nail protruding from the wall. It fluttered as though stirred by a breeze, yet the scriptorium held only water and echo. Compelled, I approached and freed the cloth, revealing an iron nail scored by rust and time. The cloth was embroidered with golden threads that shimmered faintly, weaving a lattice of stars lost to memory. I wrapped the cloth around the lantern base, binding metal and fabric in a soft shroud. The golden threads caught the pale light, sending shimmer across the mosaic's cracks. Then, with careful fingers, I laid the rune fragment atop the page and smoothed it against the vellum, as though pressing memory back into the text. A drop of water splashed onto the lantern base, and the golden threads quivered. I watched until the glow pulsed, once, twice, then settled into a steady gleam, as though the lantern had rekindled a spark long drowned. The fissures in the mosaic seemed to radiate outward, and for a moment, the wheel's spokes glowed like veins of light beneath the water's skin. I sank to the edge of the pool, heart thrumming with the scriptorium's slow heartbeat. In the hush that followed, I lifted the alabaster lantern base and found a hidden latch beneath, the remnants of a compartment, once meant for oil. There I placed the runestone, nestling it among the golden threads. The chamber snapped shut, and the lantern base glowed brighter still, casting a soft radiance that held the manuscripts in its gentle arc. Around me, the water stilled, and the smudged manuscripts drifted into the lantern's halo as though drawn by the light. I held the alabaster base close, its warmth a quiet pulse against my palms. The pages, once so fragile, now lay illuminated, their words half legible in the gentle glow. I rose and walked the length of the scriptorium, carrying the lantern base before me as though it were the sun reborn. The water parted in ripples, carrying driftwood and ink fragments aside. I passed beneath collapsed rafters and over shelving turned to ruin. Each step felt measured, a silent procession. Past the scattered tomes, past the hushed niches, past the wells of ink where time had pooled like spilled wine. At the far wall, a mural remained, faded but discernible. A procession of robed figures carrying lanterns through flooded streets. Their lamps glowed like distant stars, and their faces were turned away, anonymous in their vigil. I pressed, the lantern base against the mural, watching as its glow seeped into the painted forms. For a moment, I saw the figures come alive, their robes ripple, their lanterns shimmer, their silent march continue beyond the mural's frame. Then the glow receded, and the mural returned to dust and pigment. I stood in the fading radiance, lantern base cradled like a beating heart, manuscripts drifting around my feet. The hush pressed in, heavy yet consoling, like a vow whispered across centuries, that words, however faded, endure in memory, and that light, however dimmed, can be rekindled. I knelt to gather the page and the rune fragment, folding them together like a letter sealed in ink. The alabaster lantern base I left behind, anchored to the mural by its golden threads and rune-bound heart. As I backed away, I saw the manuscripts rise on the water's surface, forming a circle around the mural, as though paying homage. At the scriptorium's mouth, the world beyond smelled of brine and dawn. I carried the folded page and rune fragment close, feeling their stories pulse beneath the cloth. Behind me, the alabaster lantern glowed softly, a beacon for those who wander through drowned words and forgotten lore. I stepped into the salt-soaked air, the scriptorium's hush fading into memory. In my coat lay the fragile page, its prayer unfinished, the rune fragment, its song suspended, and the lantern base's absence, a promise that some light remains, even in the deepest dark. Ahead, the tide awaited, and I walked toward it, each step guided by the faint glow that lingered in my hand and the hush that follows all stories yet to be told. A brittle stillness greeted me at the entrance of the hollow atrium, where marble columns once bore glass canopies, and the scent of lilies filled every corner. Now the panes lay shattered, shards of crystal strewn like fallen stars across a floor mottled with cracked mosaic. Ivy had crept in through rents in the walls, its tendrils tangled with rusted iron frames, their leaves curled and browned like parchment in the sun. I stepped carefully among the haze of dust, each footprint a soft exclamation in the hush. Light sifted down through ragged openings overhead, landing on a single dais at the atrium's heart. 3 stone basins, arranged in a triangle, rose from the cracked tile, one carved of onyx, one of alabaster, and one of limestone. Each held a different remnant of the atrium's glory: water-stained petals pressed into glass fragments, bronze clasps oxidized green, and powdered alabaster that crumbled at the brush of my sleeve. In their decay lay echoes of processions long ended and vows whispered to absent deities. I approached the onyx basin first. Its interior was streaked with a film of black water, and within floated a cluster of seed pods, their husks split open like silent mouths. I knelt and lifted one to my palm. Its shell was brittle, and when I squeezed gently, it disintegrated into a dust of obsidian that drifted upward in swirls. The particles settled on my coat, cool specks that traced faint constellations across the fabric. Rising, I carried the seed dust to the alabaster basin. Inside, petals of translucent stone lay heaped, their edges chipped as though gnawed by time. I scattered the obsidian dust among them, watching as the black motes slipped between pale petals, staining them with remembrance. The basin's surface trembled, and I thought I heard a whisper of wind that might have been a name I once knew. The limestone basin held the shards of glass from the canopy above, each fragment glimmering with a rainbow of prismatic tears. I reached in and pressed a sliver of glass against my lips. Its edge was smooth but cold, and in its reflection, I saw the atrium's columns bend inward as though watching me. I slipped the shard into my coat pocket, its weight a sting against my ribs. With the seed dust and petals mingled, I rose and stood in the atrium's center, the 3 basins forming a silent triad around me. Ivy coiled at my ankles, its dead leaves crunching underfoot. I closed my eyes and listened to the hush. No drip of water, no rustle of leaf, only the slow echo of memory woven into every crack and stain. When I opened my eyes, the atrium had shifted. Light fractured through glass shards embedded in the marble floor, scattering rainbow prisms across the columns. In their glow, vines etched themselves into the stone, as though the ivy sought to reclaim the marble's smooth surface. I walked to the nearest column and pressed a palm against the carving, feeling embedded tremors beneath my fingers. A fragment of parchment stirred at the base of the column, half buried in the seed dust. I knelt and retrieved it. Another page, torn from some codex of prayers, its words nearly effaced by mildew. Only one line remained legible, and in decay, we find our promise. The phrase pulsed in my mind, resonant with the atrium's collapse and the quiet exhalations of ancient oaths. I wrapped the parchment around the shard of glass, binding text and reflection in a delicate conjunction. The seed dust clung to the fragile bundle, promising that new growth might spring from ruin. I carried it to the limestone basin and let it float among the prismatic fragments. The shard within caught a beam of light and flared, throwing sparks of color onto the alabaster petals and onyx basin's beads of black water. A hush deeper than before settled over the space. The column's ivy leaves rustled without wind, as though whispering a benediction. I circled the basins and gathered a handful of alabaster petals and a pinch of obsidian dust on my palm. Then I pressed my palm to the column's surface, palms leaving a tracing of decay and hope in equal measure. Above me, the ruined canopy's glass quivered. Some fragment caught and refracted a shaft of sunlight into a narrow beam that found the parchment bundle in the limestone basin. It illuminated the torn words, and I thought I saw new ink emerge, a tendril of script that wove between the faded letters like a reclamation. I smiled, though the smile felt hollow against the atrium's quiet grandeur. I left the parchment and shard behind and stepped towards the onyx basin. I scooped up the black water in my cupped hands and let it wash over the alabaster petals I still carried. The water's surface folded them into dark hollows, and I watched as each petal sank until only tiny pale flecks remained. Then I lifted the petals and dusted them across my coat, a constellation of white on black, a mirror of memory and stain. The limestone basin held my final relic, a bronze clasp shaped like the leaf of a maidenhair fern. I plucked it from the shards, its metal cool and pitted. Somehow, it felt as though the atrium's very spirit lay within its curve, a fragment of ceremonial regalia that had slipped free in the atrium's final hours. I pressed the clasp against my heart, feeling its weight settle among the other relics I carried. As I did so, the basin's triangle pulsed once. First the onyx with a deep guttural tremor, then the alabaster with a shift of light that scattered prisms across the marble. Finally, the limestone with a soft exhalation of sunlit dust. In that moment, the atrium seemed to acknowledge me, a pilgrim who had come to weave its fragments back into the tapestry of memory. I walked to the archway and paused, turning back to regard the three basins. Ivy dripped like tears from the columns above, and pale vines snaked across the floor's cracked designs. The air was heavy with the scent of stone and rot, but also with a faint sweetness, like a blossom reborn in the mind's eye. I felt the weight of the atrium's sorrow and its stubborn pulse of endurance. Then I stepped through the arch and into the courtyard beyond, leaving the basins to their vigil. The broken glass glittered where the sunlight touched it, and the column's shadows stretched long across the ground. I walked through the mist of dust and ivy, the bronze clasp beating against my chest, and carried the atrium's hush within me, bound within the shard of glass, the seed dust, the faded parchment, and the touch of alabaster and onyx. Beyond the courtyard, an overgrown path wound toward a grove where the wind held songless laments. There, I paused once more, gathering breath for the journey ahead. The atrium's remnants lay behind me, but its memory pulsed in my veins, a quiet flame fanned by ruin and remembrance. I stepped into the dusk and continued on, each footfall echoing the atrium's rhythm, decay and grace, silence and ceremony, the slow reclamation of what must never be forgotten. Dawn's first breath found me at the crest of the hollow barrow, where earthen mounds rose like whispered secrets beneath a sky of muted grey. The grass atop the tumuli was silvered by frost. Each blade bowed in quiet homage to seasons long surrendered. A circle of standing stones mottled with lichen and moss encircled the largest mound, their fractured tops leaning inward as though in conference. I passed between two monoliths, their surfaces etched with faint grooves, traces of carvings worn to nothing but memory. At the mound's base, a low archway yawned into darkness, its stones slick with frost and ivy tendrils that crept from root to crumbling keystone. Frost-crisp air whispered through the opening, carrying an echo of distant chants I could not place. I knelt and pressed a palm to the keystone, feeling the chill seep into my bones, as if the barrow inhaled my warmth and held it for centuries. Inside, the tunnel sloped gently downward, walls shifting from frost-pocked stone to bare earth in smooth gradient. Each footfall echoed softly, as though the barrow itself recorded my passage in hollow chambers deep within. I carried the relics against my chest, bone parchment talisman, bronze clasp, glass shard bound with faded script, and felt their collective weight settle like stones in my heart. At the tunnel's end, a vaulted chamber opened into dim radiance. Lichen glow seeped through cracks in the ceiling, painting the walls in ghostly green filigree. Here lay burial alcoves carved into the earth, niches once holding bodies swathed in shrouds that had long dissolved into the soil. In one alcove, a single wooden plank remained, its grain bleached and splintered, stained by age. Upon it rested the silver armlet, its filigree darkened, glowing faintly in the sallow light. I knelt and traced the armlet's curve, feeling its cool surface against my fingertips. The hollow whisper of its circle spoke of vigil kept, a promise unbroken. I lifted it and draped it around my wrist, its weight a gentle reminder of all that had come before. The chamber's hush deepened, and I thought I heard the groan of earth settling, as though the barrow recognized its sentinel and exhaled a breath held since memory began. I rose and moved to the next alcove, where earthen shelves held offerings of stone and bone. There, I laid the bronze clasp upon a flat stone, its fern carving echoing ridges in the rock. I let my palm hover above it, feeling the void between clasp and stone, a space pregnant with presence. The lichen's glow pulsed, and I imagined the iron's memory, hands that had fastened cloaks, hearts that had beat beneath its curve. Beyond the alcoves, the chamber widened into a central space. In its center stood a low altar of rough-hewn stone, smoothed by the touch of countless pilgrims. I set upon it the bone parchment talisman, folded between root and ink. Its word hovered between remember and renounce, a hinge upon which fate turned. I opened the bundle and pressed the parchment to the altar's face, its fibers cold and damp as though soaked in tears. A soft sigh rippled through the chamber. No wind, no voice, but the barrow's own lament. I closed my eyes and let the hush settle within me, a hymn of absence more resonant than any song. When I opened them again, the parchment's ink glimmered with fresh clarity. Letters once blurred, now sharp, spelling not a word, but a single rune that matched those I bore elsewhere. It glowed against the stone, a silent covenant between relic and earth. In the alcove opposite the armlet, I found a shallow basin carved into the floor, its lip lined with iron rings that once held chains or cords. Inside lay a single obsidian petal, its ash-grey form a fragile bloom. I lifted it and pressed its curve against my chest, feeling its brittle sorrow bloom in my heart. I then placed it beside the talisman on the altar, letting its sharp edge trace a line of grief across the stone. I paused, breath trembling, for the chamber seemed to hold its breath in kind. Each relic I had carried now found its place. The armlet on my wrist, the clasp resting in tribute, the talisman and petal anchored to the altar. Only the shards of glass and the leaden echo of the lantern base had yet to be placed. I removed the glass-bound fragment of faded script from my coat and approached the altar's side. The shard of glass caught the lichen's glow and fractured it into delicate arcs on the floor. I laid the fragment upon the stone, the words drifting back into view, lines of vow and lament woven through the water's kiss. The shimmer of glass refracted the rune's light, and the chamber trembled with a whisper of song. So soft, it might have been a flower unfolding in deep winter. Now, only the alabaster lantern base remained. I took it from my pack, its golden threads dimmed but persistent, and carried it to the barrow's hearth. A shallow ember pit hewn into the floor, gold stones ringed with charcoal stains. I set the lantern base within the pit, letting its curves rest against stone that had held flame once, perhaps to guide the departed to rest. I knelt and gathered a pinch of seed dust from my pocket, its black motes drifting like tiny stars. I scattered them over the lantern's rim, watching as each mote caught the lichen's glow and pulsed faintly before drifting away. The asters of dust settled upon alabaster and old rune alike, binding relics to hearth and earth. Above, the barrow's vault shivered. Motions unseen stirred shadows into shapes that quivered at the periphery. Drifting motes of dust, curling lichen, the memory of breath. I closed my eyes and listened as the chamber's heartbeat aligned with mine, slow, steady, a covenant of bone and stone. When I opened my eyes, the altar's circle lay complete. Talisman and petal, clasp and armlet, glass and dust, lantern and rune. Each piece anchored to the barrow's memory, held in vigil by the standing stones above. I pressed my palm to the altar's edge, feeling the stone's cold and coarse embrace, and uttered a vow carried on the barrow's sigh, that I would carry their stories onward, beyond the hush of this tomb. A slow breath moved through the chamber, and I felt the earth beneath my knees shift. An ascent or a farewell, I could not tell. Gently, I rose and backed away, leaving space around the altar as one leaves room for a gift. Each standing stone shadow stretched toward me, silent silhouettes of sentinel watchers. At the tunnel's mouth, frost-laden grass brushed my calves. Light had shifted to a colder hue, as though the sky had held its breath at my reverent passage. I turned back once, seeing the barrow's arch gleam with the rune's faint glow, and the standing stones ring the mound in mute counsel. I stepped into the open air, relics resting now within my coat, etched in memory, bound by the barrow's hush. The frost cracked underfoot in staccato whispers, and I felt the weight of winter's promise in each brittle blade. Ahead, the sky trembled with dawn's hesitant light, a promise that even decay yields to new passage. With one last look at the burial mound, I walked along the frosted path, carrying the barrow's vigil within me. Each relic pulsed against my heart, bone and ink, bronze and silver, glass and dust. Between memory and decay, their stories glimmered, guiding me onward through the hush of waking world, towards the final circle where the ancient truth would finally unfold. The road beyond the hollow barrow led through heather-scented moorland, where dawn's breath lay heavy in dew-wet grasses, and the earth's bones whispered beneath each footfall. I carried the relics, now folded into the folds of my cloak. The coin of a broken star, the silver armlet of winding roots, the obsidian petals, and runestone from the drowned chapel, the shard of clay and iron from the kiln, the alabaster lantern base, the page of water-ruined script bound in glass, and the bronze fern clasp. Each lay pressed against the next, a constellation of sorrow and promise cradled against my chest. Beyond the moor rose the broken spire, a lone tower on an island of slate, its stones hewn from sky-fallen rock. The land here bore the hush of deep memory, grass tufted between cracks, lichens weaving filigree across weathered walls, and a single narrow window high above where light never reached. I approached, each step measured as though I walked upon the thrum of some ancient heart. At the tower's base, a threshold of basalt formed a dais cracked by wind and frost. I set my burden there and knelt, tracing the worn grooves where pilgrims once pressed offerings of lashings and vows. My fingers hovered above an inscription half erased by time. The star that bore our grief shall light our ruin. The words pulsed, faintly luminous, as though awaiting the final act. I rose and carried the relics into the tower's shadowed interior. Within, the air was heavy with the scent of salt and ash. The walls bore shallow niches, 12 in all, each once holding a lamp, a bowl, a token. Now each niche lay empty, save for a single remnant, a silver coin here, a serpent-bound armlet there, a petal turned to glass in another. It was as though the tower held the echoes of all I had gathered, beckoning me to return each relic to its place. I began at the first niche, where a carved rose blossomed in low relief. From my cloak, I produced the tarnished coin, its star face still etched with an echo of broken light. I placed it in the niche, and the rose's petals caught what remained of dawn's glow, scattering it across the slate. The beam flickered, a breath held and released. In the second niche, set within the curve of a winding vine motif, I laid the silver armlet. It fit as though born there, its roots entwining the carving's spirals, binding metal to stone. The vine gleamed, lichen darkening to verdant green, as though revived by the touch. One by one, I returned each relic, the obsidian petals to the niche carved like a chalice, the runestone to a hollow in the hearthstone, the kiln's iron tongue to an alcove flanked by falling ash veins, the alabaster fragment where a candle once stood, the glass-bound page where water had pooled, and the bronze fern clasp in the niche shaped like a leaf's curve. With each offering, the tower stirred. Light kindled in its highest window, first a wavering spark, then a steady glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. The walls shivered in resonance, and I felt the hush of centuries rippling outward across moor and ruin. At the final niche, a deep alcove carved in the likeness of a kneeling figure, I placed the last relic, a shard of clay from the orchard's puzzle, where rot revealed the seed of new life. The shard fit precisely in the figure's cupped hands. In that moment, the tower's glow flared, and dust motes rose like flint sparks, dancing in the sudden warmth. I stepped back to the dais. The relics now rose in a silent chorus, each niche a silent promise fulfilled. At the tower's summit, beyond sight, I imagined the lighthouse's lantern rekindling, its beam born not from flame, but from memory itself, a star reborn. Below, the tower exhaled a soundless song. The moor responded. Heather bowed, grasses whispered, and distant stones trembled. In my veins, I felt the pulse of Earth's sorrow woven into every step I'd taken. Each relic, an echo of grief, transformed into light. I knelt before the dais and gathered the final hush into my hands. It was not tangible, more a weight of silence, woven from all the places I had seen. The fog-choked tower, the drowned temple, the fen's runestone, the burned chapel, the cavern's bone and ink, the gorgeous dryad, the kiln, the scriptorium, the atrium, the barrow. I pressed the absence into my palms, and the tower's glow seeped into me. A flicker of dawn carried into bone and marrow. A low wind sighed through the narrow window above, carrying a fragrance of sea foam and lichen. I closed my eyes, and in that unlit chamber, I saw the story's hidden seam, a sacred cycle of decay and remembrance, each ruin reverent of the last. The relics had mapped a journey, a pilgrimage from broken light to shared glow. When I opened my eyes, the tower was silent but alive. The niches no longer appeared as empty hollows, but as a whole, a star-shaped bloom unfurling in stone. The dais beneath me felt warm, resonant, as though the tower's spirit lay beneath its surface, cradled in ruin. I rose then and turned towards the narrow window. Beyond lay the moor, its muted dawn now brightening sky and stone. The tower's light reached the horizon, a slender thread of hope braided with sorrow. I pressed my palm to the window's frame, recalling the first time I saw the lighthouse's lantern pulse across salt-blossomed cliffs. In that moment, I understood. The truth whispered through all the metaphor's hush. That memory and decay are bound in sacred partnership, each giving rise to the other, like tide and moon. The relics I carried were fragments of a single heart, scattered across time and place, waiting to be returned to their cradle. My hands trembling, I wiped a smear of lichen from the window's edge. The light outside steadied, and I felt the warmth of a sunrise I had not expected to witness. Yet as the sky brightened, a tremor of loss ran through me. The knowledge that this revelation would not heal the scars, but would bind them into the marrow of the world, irreversible as ancestral sorrow. I stepped away from the window and moved to the dais once more. In its center lay a shallow bowl carved of slate, its interior mottled with the dust of ages. I placed the palm of my hand into the bowl and let the tower's glow flow through me, spilling across the stone. The light pooled there, a pyre of remembrance, and I felt it burn through my bones. Up the spiral stairs I climbed, relics left behind, carrying only that final imprint of glow, the distilled essence of every silence, every decay, every remembered wound. At the summit, the narrow window opened to sky and sea. The tower's beams arched out, weaving a lattice of light across wave and wind. I stood there, the wind's salt kiss on my face, and whispered thanks to the scattered shards of memory now consecrated in stone. The sky above was vast, and the tower's glow peaked like a star reborn in dark water. Yet beneath that shining thread lay the moor's quiet heave, the barrow's frost-gold earth, the orchard's rot, The cavern strip, the atrium's dust, wounds that would never close. I turned from the light and descended. The tower exhaled behind me, its glow dimming to a soft pulse, a vigil unending. At the base, I found the dais bare once more, its slate smoothed of dust and echo. I knelt and pressed a final kiss to its surface, feeling the echo of my palm imprint upon rock and memory. Beyond the threshold, the moor lay hushed beneath rising sun. I walked away without looking back, carrying nothing but the imprint of that final glow in my bones. The niches remained, the relics returned, the tower's promise fulfilled, and yet, suspended in the hush of what cannot be undone. Ahead, the road wound into mist and memory. Each step echoed the tower's slow cadence, decay and remembrance entwined. The world held its breath as I passed, and I heard the sea's distant murmur, a prayer whispered too late, yet reverberating across ruin and renewal, binding all that had ever been into an irreversible song of sacred sorrow.